Okay, I think we'll get going. So good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening for the latest in our webinar series. My name is Pádraig Fogarty. I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. And if you don't know us already, the Irish Wildlife Trust is a non-governmental organization. We're a charitable organization. We've been around since 1979, and our job is to raise awareness of the importance of nature to people as well as for its own self. Just a few housekeeping issues for this evening. The event is being recorded, and so if you later want to share it with friends, it'll be on our YouTube site later in the week. If you have questions, I would ask you please look at the bottom of your screen. You will see there's a Q&A function. Please put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A. Don't put your questions in the chat because it's only me here, and I will only be monitoring the Q&A instead of the chat. So that's really the two important things to tell you about. So we have a fantastic pair of speakers for you this evening. I think you're going to find this very, very interesting. And we're going to be talking about rewilding. And rewilding is a very exciting topic. Those of you who are familiar with the Irish Wildlife Trust will know that we like talking about rewilding. And we were very much fans of what rewilding has to promise. But tonight, I think it's going to be interesting because we're going to hear about some other perspectives from some other European countries, and in some cases, how rewilding is happening on the ground. Some people seem to think that rewilding is still aspirational or some time off in the future, but in fact, rewilding is something that is being applied at the moment. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker for you tonight. Jordi Palau is a forest engineer and has a master's degree in protected area management. He has been the manager of 2 natural parks and 3 national game reserves in Catalonia in Spain. One of them, Beaumort, a pilot site for rewilding, and he has also advised some Spanish private estates which are interested in conservation and ecotourism. Jordi has traveled widely around the world, visiting rewilding sites in Africa and Eurasia and the Americas, where he has got to know these places for firsthand. And in 2020, he published a book, and this is the book. It's a fantastic book. It's called Rewilding Iberia. It's in Spanish, so either you have to learn Spanish or we have to hope that the publishers will publish it in English. You'll see it is quite a meaty, substantial book, but it is really wonderful. I'm not aware of anything like it in the English language, so it would be a wonderful thing if it was translated. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Jordi, who will give us his presentation. So in your own time.
Well, okay, thank you very much, Pádraig, and good evening to everybody. First of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this event, which is quite interesting, quite exciting for me because it is the opportunity to explain the work that I have been preparing about the potential for rewilding in Spain to an audience that is not Spanish or mainly not Spanish. So for me, it is very, very interesting, and I hope also that this will be interesting for you all. Now I will share my screen to begin with the presentation, and then I hope that we'll have time for questions or other issues that you find interesting. Well, this presentation will speak mainly about the potential of rewilding in Spain, which is the main subject of the book Rewilding Iberia that Patrick has kindly introduced. And I will speak with a general overview of rewilding applied to the Spanish context, and then we'll see some examples or some kind of areas where rewilding could be applied or is beginning to being applied in some cases. Well, first of all, I must apologize for my English because I'm not very used to speaking English. But first of all, I want to make a brief introduction of Spain as a country. It is about 500,000 square kilometers in area, with a population of almost 47 million people. So the mean density is about 92 inhabitants per square kilometer. But this varies greatly between areas. As you can see in the map on the left, Spain has a very diverse geography with some very important mountain ranges. In fact, it is one of the most mountainous countries in Europe. And there are also depressions or flat areas, which give the country a huge biodiversity. In fact, on the right, in this above, you can see the main biomes of Spain, which are divided into two main zones: the Atlantic one in the north mainly, and the Mediterranean one, which is in the central and south of Spain and in the east. And there are the mountains make those biomes even more diverse. And then you can see in the map on the right below, you can see the protected areas, including Natura 2000 network, which amounts for almost 30% of the country, of the land area. So it is a quite important figure. And when we speak about conservation in Spain, I think that it is important to take a bit of perspective and to analyze where do we come from. And we come from, in Spain, the most immediate baseline for conservation in Spain comes from what we could call the traditional rural landscape, which is represented in this aerial photo of 1945 of an anonymous place in the middle of Catalonia, northeastern Spain, in which you can see more or less that it is a very open country with many cultivated areas, and the areas that were not cultivated were grazed, were used for livestock rearing in extensive system, or were used for fuel wood collection, and there were very few forests left. So we had a country not everywhere, of course, but in many areas, we had a country with a mosaic of traditional, of open areas derived from a traditional use that apparently was the same for many centuries, although, of course, it had many ups and downs and many variations, which are not always well understood, or well, people is not always aware of this. But this traditional rural landscape was, of course, very good for some kind of wildlife or some kind of species. For example, the species related with open areas, and also rabbits, partridges, some raptors. It was a very rich landscape. But other species, for example, the species related with forest, were almost absent in many areas. From this traditional rural landscape, we evolved to two possible options. And I will present them very shortly. One option has been what we could call a huge process of spontaneous rewilding. And this is the case mainly in the place of the previous image, because it has been almost completely covered with forest, with a continuous forest, relatively young in age, And this has meant a change of landscape and a change of wildlife. The main aspects of this new landscape of this kind of spontaneous rewilding or rural activities, abandonment in some way, has been a landscape with some important problems in the context of nowadays, in the context of climate change, in the context of our present situation. For example, we have landscape homogenization in a very important scale because of the continuous of forest. And in Spanish, we have a word which is matorralización, which means some colonization, complete colonization of an area by scrap, by low forest vegetation, let's say, which is a problem because of the lack of reduction in landscape diversity. And this new landscape of this spontaneous rewilding has also other problems. For example, with water absorption, the more trees in the landscape, the more water they consume. So there are less water running in the system. An obvious problem, which is a highest risk of wildfires. This is so important that even the firefighters have a term, which is the fire extinction paradox, which means that if we are very successful over time suppressing natural or artificial forest fires, suppressing fires, if we are very successful in this job, then forest biomass is growing and growing and growing. So maybe there will be a moment in which there will be a catastrophic fire that will be impossible to control. This is the fire extinction paradox, and this is something related with this kind of landscapes. And of course, there is a forest wildlife recovery. Some species are winners and others are losers. And in this landscape, we have, for example, a species like roe deer that was completely extinct from Catalonia 50 years ago. Now it is present almost in the whole area in Catalonia, for example. But the most successful species representing this forest wildlife recovery is the wild boar, which is present everywhere and is a matter of many problems of crop damages, of road accidents, and so on. This is one of two possible scenarios that have come from that traditional rural landscape. But then there has been another possible scenario, another different scenario, which is one of agriculture intensification. And this is represented by, especially by the large image. The smaller photo on the left is from one extreme case, which is in southeastern Spain, in Almeria. There is a huge area of greenhouse agriculture, which is something like some kind of sea of plastic. This is a very extreme case, but you can imagine that nature here is not doing very well. But on the main photo, you can see one example of landscape that is in the process of intensification, and there are other landscapes more intensified, which lead, this process that leads also to landscape homogenization, this is a very different landscape from the previous one, but the result is not so different, landscape homogenization. In this case, with a very important use of chemical products, fertilizers, pesticides, antiparasitics, which are a very important problem for our invertebrate populations, which are suffering from this problem, use of chemical products in the agriculture intensification, but also the loss of diversity in the previous landscape is supposing part or is causing part of the problem of the invertebrates, of insects and our small wildlife. The landscape of agriculture intensification means also water consumption, and is favored by a generalist wildlife. So we have those two possible landscapes, and there are still areas that remind us what was the traditional rural landscape, but they are less and less present, and they are deriving to one or the other of those two scenarios. And how do we conserve or try to conserve nature in this context? Well, we have had two approaches also. The first one, that was the more classical approach, was one of the strict protection. For example, exemplified in Spain with the national parks. Now there are 15 national parks in Spain. This photo is from Ordesa National Park in the Pyrenees, in Central Pyrenees. And those areas are areas where the managers try to protect strictly nature. No hunting, no fishing, no forestry, no agriculture. And this is one of the possible approaches to nature conservation. But this approach has been very rare over time, and now it is the less common. And the other approach is an approach that could be represented with an image like this, which is an approach just of trying to maintain heterogeneity in the landscape through management. And through the main characteristic of this approach is continuous management. We need to manage continuously this landscape, maintaining some kind of activities that retain this diversity, that stop vegetal succession. And we need to, this management can be delivered by the managers of a protected area, for example, or the most common way is through traditional activities, which are the remnants of that traditional landscape. Because to the people that practices those traditional activities, we are saying, well, you must stay here with your activity because it is good for the landscape, for the sustainability, for wildlife, but you cannot change your activity, because if this farmer that is in the picture wants to change his crop, for example, maybe for one with an irrigation system, which is something that he could do in theory, we will say, no, please don't do this, because we need you in this point, which is the good point for conservation. And we need to do this permanently, year after year after year, even if this is an economic activity, because at last those are economic activities that are not competitive or are not good in the present economy, let's say. So we have some kind of problem. This is in the Pyrenees, but here we also have, for example, high meadows, and in those meadows we need the same. This man staying in the area and doing this job, but in a very special way. And if this is abandoned and nature takes this area, for us this is a problem. For us as a conservationist, because we can lose habitat diversity and species diversity. We can lose open habitat species in this case. So we are in a difficult situation that George Monbiot exemplified well with this title, The Naturalists Who Are Terrified of Nature, because in the end there is something like this, no? And this is some kind of a paradox. To conserve nature, we need to manage nature intensively and permanently. Not only intensively, but permanently, we must be doing the same activities, because if not, the state of the habitats or of the species will change, and we don't want this change. So we have some kind of static photo. Maybe we are affected by what has been called the shifting baseline syndrome. So we have forgotten in some way how nature worked before us, or how nature. It is not so important the time moment, but how or which are the main factors, the main processes that shape ecosystems and that generate diversity, heterogeneity in nature. And we have forgotten this because we have changed some of the natural processes that generate diversity. We have changed those processes by artificial processes, let's say, that imitate those natural processes, but are not exactly the same. If we remember, if we could be able to remember how nature worked before our decisive influence in the landscape, we could see that we had a mosaic of different natural processes, large rivers that were flooding the floodplains, large herbivores that were maintaining open areas or even creating open areas of vegetation. We had fire we had different natural processes, as are shown in this image, which represents a place of central Spain in the last glaciation, which is not the best example because now we are not in a glaciation, we are in an interglacial period. So this is not a good example as a reference for the present moment. But from learning from the past, we can see what shaped biodiversity, what shaped habitat heterogeneity in the past during the evolution of life. And we can take inspiration from this. Well, at first glance, we could see rural abandonment is the same as rewilding. If we make an approach of hands-off, then those ancient cultivated areas are progressively occupied by nature. And we could say that's okay. But rural abandonment is not exactly the same as rewilding. There is something lacking. And what is lacking relates to what we said in this image, what we said speaking about this image, which are the some natural processes. In our ecosystems, in the world in general, there are natural processes shaping the diversity and the heterogeneity of ecosystems, and biodiversity is a result of the species adapting to those different conditions. And of those natural processes, there are some of them that are still present in our countryside. For example, if you go to a mountain area high enough, you can see that snow avalanches, more or less, are still present in the ecosystem. While we have snow, of course, but when we have snow, we have avalanches and windstorms, for example, that can create clearings in the forest are still present. So there are some natural processes that create diversity that are still present in general in the right places, but there are some processes that are mainly suppressed by our activity, and those processes are basically, or I suggest that are basically those that we have here. Ecologic succession or vegetal succession, but not in general, because in general it's occurring everywhere, but in the last stages, in the old growth forest, because we have suppressed those areas of old growth forest because it was not interesting for timber production, traditionally. The natural or the free flowing of water in the ecosystem, especially in large floodplains, has been almost completely stopped. Forest fire is still present, of course, but it is exceptionally suppressed in relation with its probable natural occurrence, especially in some areas. There are some areas that, because of anthropogenic use, have regular fires, but is not the case everywhere. And then we have also the processes exercised by large mammals, large wildlife, which is large enough to shape the ecosystem. And this is, for example, the case of the large herbivores. Here you can see some of the diversity of large herbivores of Spain in a Holocene baseline. But and you have also here their domestic equivalents that in part have maintained some of the natural processes that were done by those wild ungulates. But the important thing is not only to have wild ungulates, but to have a guild with different species of wild ungulates. And if we have some large herbivores, for example, we need also their predators and the scavengers that consume their remains. And all those factors combined are the sources of biodiversity, of landscape heterogeneity. And this is exemplified with this drawing. If we only have natural succession, which is the case of rural abandonment, or the case of the strict protection areas, if we don't do anything else, we have this situation. The vegetation is growing and growing, and we have large areas, quite large areas in those intermediate stages of monotonous forest, young forest, which is very prone to large wildfires that, when happen, are catastrophic. Instead, rewilding speaks us of recovering the natural processes that are lacking in the system. And following this same example, we could imagine that if we recover the role of large herbivores in this ecosystem, the diversity would be greater, at least with moderate populations of those large herbivores. Of course, if they don't have predators, they can also grow too much so as to modify in another degree the vegetation. But in general, if you have a diversity of herbivores in this same landscape, you will have a more diverse, a more heterogeneous result. And even if forest fire comes, it will be smaller, and it will be even good, because herbivores and fire are the two main consumers of biomass, of vegetal biomass in large parts of the world. So it is very important to have those two processes active. Rewilding is not only about recovering the role of large mammals or the role of fire, but also to recover the role of water moving freely in the floodplains. This is the current approach. We have rivers and we have protections very close to the river to avoid the flooding of those areas. And this can be okay in normal situations, but when comes large flooding, it can be catastrophic also. With a rewilding approach, we could put those protections far from the river, and this could deliver us more natural habitats in the floodplain with all the advantages of this natural process, and probably a greater resilience, a greater resistance in front of flooding. And to explain the idea of rewilding in a Spanish context, I think that we could take the same image of before and imagine how this could be in another context of maybe rewilding, of recovering the natural processes. And this is very important to bear in mind that this is only an example to show how conservation could be in some places, because of course we need agriculture, we need livestock, we need many human activities. So this is not something to apply everywhere. Of course, this is something to apply in some places if it is possible. But this same landscape with a different management conception could seem something like this, with all the main drivers of natural processes of habitat heterogeneity in place, with fire, for example, in some cases, with herbivores, with their predators, with scavengers. And this could deliver an enormous richness of biodiversity, even with a species that now we think that they are only related to human activities. For example, the lesser kestrel that you see here is a species that we think that this species can only survive in sustainable agricultural areas in some kind of cultivated land, but in fact it had its natural place in the ecosystem, and we have lost this natural place. So this is an idea of how rewilding could look like in some places, and this could deliver another results in terms of conservation, but also in terms of opportunities for people living around those areas, because those areas, we don't have those areas. So if we had one, that could be a very nice place, a very interesting place for scientific research and for different reasons. So we could, it could be very interesting even for people living here to work and to have new opportunities that maybe sometimes in some areas that are being abandoned, those opportunities are lacking. Well, this is the basic conceptual idea to begin with, but there are challenges also. The mainstream of conservation in Spain can tell you that rewilding is not necessary for conservation, or that it is not possible because of a high level of land transformation. Well, there are challenges for rewilding, for example, the unawareness of the concept and negative perception. I think that it is because we people are prone to black or white debates, no? Or agriculture or rewilding. Well, rewilding is not an option to to change agriculture or to replace agriculture, but it can be one more thing to do in some places that could be appropriate, as simple as this. We have in general fear of natural processes, especially those that we feel that can go out of control. We have some legal limitations also, and we have some kind of self-complacency about our protected area network. As I said before, we have almost a 30% of land area protected, but if we could see this same protected area according to the most important level of protection, categories 1 or 2 of IUCN categories of management of protected areas, we could see that we only have less than 1% of Spain fully protected with those categories. So maybe our protection level is not so good because, for example, the new strategy of biodiversity for the European Union says that we should have 30% of land protected by 2030, which is something that Spain has almost accomplished, but also that 1/3 of this, so 10% of the land area, should be strictly protected. And in this case, we are very, very, very far from this goal. So we can ask two questions. The first one, if rewilding is interesting in Spain. I think that it is interesting for different reasons that I have been explaining more or less through this presentation. Ethical, intrinsic value, especially now we are in the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. A functional argument, for example, rewilding is close to natural-based solutions for some of our problems. So it is a very interesting way, and a way that is good for biodiversity also. Economy, there are, as I have mentioned, new economic opportunities for rural areas. Scientific knowledge, aesthetic, health, education in well protected and well conserved areas. And there is also an opportunity to do this. So I think that rewilding is interesting in Spain. Here you have the main ecosystem services delivered by different land uses, and rewilded areas are good in some cases for many aspects of ecosystem services. For example, water regulation, habitat for biodiversity, recreation, soil and nutrient protection. And this is not to oppose rewilding to other uses, but to bear in mind that rewilding could be another one in some areas. The second question that is important to try to answer is if rewilding is possible in Spain. And I defined I analyzed which could be the main factors that could make rewilding more or less suitable for an area in the Spanish context. And I saw those four main groups: geographic factors such as area, local ecological variability, property fragmentation; socioeconomic factors such as population density. You have here the map of, in blue, the less populated areas in Spain, in red, the more populated areas. There are huge areas of few sparsely populated areas. But this is not also black and white, because rewilding could be easier sometimes in some areas which are close to large cities, for example, than in areas of the rural countryside where there are few people, but these few people is doing important activities that are still alive, that are still present. So maybe rewilding is not an option everywhere. We could see different aspects, and the most important of them, I think, that are property and the social attitude and the inclination to change, to apply new ideas in a given area. We have also ecological factors or legal factors, which are, every one of them could be analyzed. And we could generate a land use gradient, moving from abandonment, of course, or ecotourism, or even hunting, which can be land uses that are favorable to rewilding initially, to urban, industrial, or intensive agricultural areas where rewilding would not be so good. Well, in the book Rewilding Iberia, I put all those factors in a matrix to generate a suitability index that gives us the possibility to compare different areas. And this is the case, for example, applied in different national parks or natural park Spain, which lets us to see that the same kind of protected area, for example, national park, could have places which are more adequate for rewilding, and other national parks are less adequate for rewilding. And the same with natural parks. So not all the places are equally good. And here I outline which would be the typologies of the most suitable areas as core rewilding areas in Spain. First of all, state-owned properties, especially some of those devoted to conservation. For example, some national parks, some conservation-focused government estates, some national heritage properties, but also large military training areas, for example, which are some of them included in Natura 2000 network, or forests designated of public utility by regional governments. Then it would be municipality-owned properties in large abandoned areas with a lack of opportunities. That would be a good scenario, and it is happening in some cases. And third of all, and it is also happening, large private estates. For example, in the southern half of Spain, the property in general is less fragmented, and there are large properties, large estates. A lot of them are devoted to hunting. So they are in a very good conservation status in general. So if the owners of those areas want to have another use, like could be nature recovery, ecotourism, even hunting also in some cases, why not? Those could be good scenarios for rewilding. This is an example of a military training area in northeastern Spain of more than 30,000 hectares. So, and it is not cultivated at all. So it is potentially a good area. And the idea with this is to say that large scale rewilding is difficult, but it is not impossible. But there are places that are good for this activity and places that are not good. And this is what I would say to finish. Rewilding is both interesting and possible in some areas of Spain, not everywhere, of course. Where rewilding is possible, it can bring new conservation scenarios, and it can be another option, not the only one, but not one to exclude, for the problem of what is called the empty Spain, the depopulation problem. And we could shift from current protected areas, which are selected based on value, and the objective is to maintain this value forever, to rewilding areas that could be selected based on opportunity, not necessarily value. And the objective could be to restore those natural processes for a self-willed land, at least to some degree. This is not possible to be done completely, but almost. So we need to imagine new conservation scenarios beyond the current landscape. And we can think also about what makes us humans in the Anthropocene. Rewilding ecosystems or rewilded ecosystems can suggest more resilient models to conserve biodiversity, contribute also to local economy. They can allow in a controlled way the presence of some annoying natural elements, which are very important for landscape heterogeneity and biodiversity heterogeneity. And they can guide us to an optimistic conservation. In some way, we can make some kind of reconciliation with nature. And I think that making room for a wilder nature, at least in some places, could be a symptom of maturity of a civilized society. And that's more or less what I wanted to explain to you. So I think it's time to make a leap forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Jordi. That was really, really fascinating to look at your slides and to just to get a different perspective from a different country. Before we move on to Peter, I have one question for you, because Spain has a lot of the big animals that are missing in Ireland. Certainly in Ireland, we have lost an awful lot of our natural spaces and the species that have made ecosystems work. And particularly, I'm interested in predators, and I'm wondering, because Spain, I think, has perhaps the biggest population of wolves in Western Europe. And a lot of people here might say, oh, well, wolves, we need wolves to control our population of deer. We have a growing population of deer in Ireland and we have no predators. I'm just, can you comment a bit on the role of wolves in controlling the population of deer and wild boar as well, and how that's working out in Spain?
Well, recently, scientific research has shown us that that the role of predators is very important in regulating the populations of the prey, not only by reducing the numbers, but also by changing the behavior and changing the presence. So there are studies in areas which are strictly protected that have shown that predators can change the behavior of the prey, and this can lead to a recovery of vegetation, for example. This is more or less well known, speaking about rewilding, for example. But in Europe, we must take into account that wolves live in almost everywhere, live in anthropogenic landscapes. So this is not exactly the same. This is not completely comparable. And in some cases, what is happening, I think, is that wolf is not reaching what can be called the ecological effectiveness number or density. So the population of wolf is not large enough so as to control or to drive those kind of changes with prey. So they are very important in the ecosystem, and we can see in the places where they are present, they generate carcasses, for example. They play a very important role, of course, but we cannot translate exactly some research done in strictly protected areas to the anthropogenic landscapes of our European context, because as I have explained before, strictly protected areas are quite few and quite small in general in Europe. So wolves cannot reach the maximum populations that could allow the prey populations. So I think that they don't influence prey at the same level. This is not to say that they are not important or they cannot play an important role, but it is important to bear in mind those differences when thinking about those issues.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. Stay with us, Jordi. I'm sure people will have lots of questions later on. Peter, can I ask you to turn on your screen? Hi there, you're very welcome, Peter. Where are you coming from this evening? Are you in Germany or in Poland?
Well, yeah, first of all, I apologize because I had some technical problems. I'm straight in the Oder Delta, so currently on the Polish side, but you know, normally I'm tweaking around both sides, German and Poland. But today I just came back from a 8 hours or 3 hours field trip in really cold, windy, harsh weather conditions. So.
Well, I'm sure you enjoyed being outdoors. Like a lot of us don't get the pleasure even of that these days. So while you're setting up there, Peter, I'm going to introduce you here, and thank you so much for joining us. So Peter worked for the World Wildlife Fund in Germany for 15 years, where he worked on policy and nature conservation in the field of Natura 2000 and the European Union budget and structural funds. Between 2015 and 2019, he was managing director of the Baltic Sea Conservation Foundation. And since March 2020, Peter has worked as the team leader for Rewilding Oder Delta, which we're going to hear about this evening, as part of the Rewilding Europe initiative. And his task will be to create wilder nature around the Delta region that allows the reduction in human-wildlife conflicts and creating new nature-oriented business opportunities, strengthen local partnerships, and ensure funding for nature conservation actions. So Rewilding Europe, some of you might be familiar with it, a beautiful website and beautiful communication material, and working on a lot of projects around Europe. And I'd certainly encourage you all to take a look at their website. So whenever you're ready, Peter, please share your screen if you have some slides.
see my screen now? Or?
Okay, yeah, that's perfect. If you just want to maximize it.
No, it should work, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot again, and yeah, it's really nice to be here, and thank you very much for Jordi to really present the whole book and the whole ideas about rewilding. So I'm just now focusing down on a very small area of about 450,000 hectares on the border area between Germany and Poland in the very north, so on the coast to the Baltic Sea. And we'll give you a short introduction about what is Rewilding Europe, what is the Oder Delta in this, and what we are doing and how we are doing this. So Rewilding Europe is, in a way, the message, making Europe a wilder place. And it is about allowing for more natural processes, giving people more relaxing attitude towards nature, I would say. Jordi told it. We are all in human transformed landscapes, and of course rewilding is about stepping back and giving nature a bit more space to do what nature is about to do and what nature wants to do, and not how we people want nature to look like. And of course, it is about bringing back the variety of life. The wildlife comeback is a key element of it, but also the exploring of new ways how to earn a fair living from the wild. We have, in past times, we had very interesting discussions about abandonment and withdrawal of farmland, because it always sounds so negative. If farming is given up, so it means the land is not productive anymore. And our people working in nature tourism, they say, no, it's not about giving up land use or not using the land. It's not fallow land. It's land used in a different way and for different purposes and for new businesses. So I think we should also rethink the wording around what we do, that we are not giving away any kind of use, but we are changing the way how we use it, and we use it with more nature-oriented intentions. So to sum up, rewilding is a new conservation narrative. I think it's not about changing nature conservation or giving a new vision to nature conservation. I think the most aspects are very similar and not new. We heard it from Jordi. It's about nature-based solutions. It's about restoration. So all the principles of nature conservation are all the same. And I think that the aim is not being something exclusive. It's something that works in addition to what we all do already. And not every landscape, not every site is maybe, it's not useful to rewild it, but it can be one step, one aspect in the whole efforts to restore and recover biodiversity. So it's the key is natural processes, future-oriented learning from the past. Nature is an ally in solving today's challenges, connecting modern society with wild nature, and progressive moving up a scale of wildness. I think the key of nature conservation is we are used to have tiny little conservation areas or reserves, and rewilding is about connecting a bigger area, and this is what we try to do. So in Rewilding Europe, our core business are the 5 strategic areas of intervention: the wild and nature, wildlife comeback, nature businesses, interest in the wild, and magnification. Rewilding Europe, of course, the central theme is focused on the marketing and pushing life into the rewilding idea. But the key is the areas. It is about selecting areas that are suitable where this rewilding experiment can take place. And there are currently 8 areas. 2 are following. So the idea of Rewilding Europe was to create 10 areas where for at least 10 years, hundreds of thousand hectares can be rewilded. And there is a selection process, and the Oder Delta applied to this. I think it was around 2015 when Oder Delta was appointed as part of the rewilding network. And since then, a group of people is trying to work and make this rewilding idea a real case. Why the Oder Delta is important or interesting on the crossroads between Germany and Poland, but also on the crossroads of relevant migrating corridors. I think, and I was quite astonished to see this graph when I started to work for rewilding. In a way, our imagination is that the US, these wide lands, this is where wildlife is present, and wildlife thrives through the open lands. But if we look at the numbers, Europe has quite impressive numbers of large carnivores or mammals. So we have a population of 500 million, more than the US, and we have 12,000 wolves, bears. So Europe is a continent where wildlife can survive and has its place and belongs to this place. The other thing is Rewilding Europe had worked together with the IDIF Institute in Leipzig about corridors where the migration of the large carnivores takes place and how the landscape is still connected. And we know Europe is a densely populated area with a lot of infrastructures, and one of the key problems is the fragmentation, which is also the case when we talk about Natura 2000 and the connectivity of these networks. But still, we have very, very significant corridors, and one of these corridors is, let's say, the northern part, close to the Baltic coast, where still the movement of bison, wolves, elks is still functioning from east to west. And in the past years, we realized and recognized more often that, well, wolves have crossed around 10 years ago the border from Poland to Germany, and they are now common in Germany. A couple of years ago, the first bison tried to cross the German-Polish border, but was immediately shot in Germany, while around 300 bisons are thriving around the forests, not far away from the border. And we have now regular reports that elks are coming over the border to Germany. And just in our area, we have reported last year around 80 elks. So elks are more and more common on the Polish side. And since many years, their expansion from east to Western Poland is growing. And at the same time, the barriers are growing as well as the road networks are being expanded. So when we talk about the Oder Delta, we talk about an interesting and a highly diverse mosaic of different landscapes, from water to forest to wetlands, peatlands, riverbeds, and even lagoons. And so this is the parts, the mostly green parts around the lagoon is our core area where we work on. And we have the specific situation that we are situated in the south of the Baltic coast, which is a destination for mass tourism. And we have in the south the Szczecin, a big city in Poland, and a little bit further south we have even Berlin, which is just 1.5 hours away from the lagoon. So in a way, we have a low populated area with a lot of protected areas. Nearly 80% of this area is Natura 2000, but we are squeezed in between highly intensive and thriving urban agglomerations or tourist destinations. So our vision is, of course, to make this area in between this hotspots of tourism or urban life a wide corridor, let's say, that still provides a lot of nature for man and nature. And in order to get this idea through the group that founded or that started to work on rewilding, they realized that in this area is a good habitat for certain species, and they developed this idea of the big seven of the Oder Delta, from elk to wolf, beaver, sea eagle, bisons, and others. So this is how it started, that we realized we're here in a way sharing our land with these charismatic animals, and the founders of Rewilding Oder Delta, they started to use these animals as a symbol of trying to explain how to better protect this area. So this started a couple of years ago, and started with a number of remarkable wetland river restoration areas, mainly on the German side, where huge land was re-wetted due to nature conservation activities, or one area of 1,000 hectares was spontaneously flooded because some dikes broke, and then there was the decision to leave it for rewilding. The same is also that some natural heritage areas are given to NGOs by the government to manage them. But of course, still these areas were managed over hundreds of years. And it's not that you can change it from one day to another. It's also a process to withdraw from management. And this is what we are pushing also for. And this area is also a key stepstone for migration. As I said, it's from east to west. The wolves are coming in, and they are now present. Elk, bison is exploring this area. First lynx appeared in this area. And of course, one of our goals is to keep this favorable conditions that these migrations can happen. But also the lagoon itself is a huge reservoir, which is important for migrating birds. One of Europe's biggest population of sea eagles is living here. And this led to the point that finally in 2019, Rewilding Oder Delta was created as an own entity that works only in this area. So before it was several individuals, small organizations partnering, and then there was clarity. If we want to work in this area in a concentrated and a focused way, we need our own organization that works for rewilding and brings all the different stakeholders, all the different nature conservation approaches together and works on this large scale connectivity, restoration, and recovery program. But as I said, we are in between of mass tourism and urban densely populated areas. This means that we are also fighting with a lot of destructive economic and infrastructure developments, because of course it's not only nature that plays a role. We are here in the area between the Baltic, big cities, so there is a channelization of the Oder River for inland shipping. Wind farms are planned in protected areas. Road upgrading is a big problem because the main routes from south to the north to the Baltic Sea are constantly being upgraded, so that the barrier function is more and more difficult. And of course, mass tourism is a problem because, let's say, remote villages see that how tourism develops on the coast, and of course, every mayor would like to have the same marina, even if it's in a natural area. and the intensification of agriculture, not only on the land, but of course around agglomerations in not densely populated areas. There's also pressure for big poultry farms and others where all our partners and organizations we work with has constantly fight also against it. So what we are working on, the protection of the lagoon for water birds is an issue, but this is mainly fighting pollution, because the pollution comes from runoffs and other uses. River restoration and wetlands are important here. We have always to deal with regulated rivers, and rewilding rivers means we need to take back the regulatory work that has been done often over several hundred years. Of course, the wildlife comeback is for us a very important issue, and here the corridors are one point, but also the acceptance. People need to learn to live with these big animals, and we see it very well, because on the polar side, people are used. The elks are present, wolves are present, so it's not a problem. Bisons are roaming around, not far away from the houses. But when we go to the German side, it's simply that people have not seen or have not realized that these animals are so close to them, and it's a learning process to see that this is not a danger, this is not a threat, this is something that just happens, and it doesn't cause necessary problems. And of course, all over this is the idea of creating economic opportunities through nature tourism, and this means also awareness rising. We're competing, let's say, if we look on the water side, of course, we see a development of attractive jet skiing exercises and others. And I think this is a hard competition to deal with this and to show that a nature-oriented tourism can be as effective as maybe this fun-oriented tourism activities. But it's a very hard competition if you are in a remote area, which is maybe not very rich. So yes, what we do is we have the lagoon with around 1,700 hectares. We have in the past years around 10,000 hectares of reflooded land that we can give now back to nature and observe the processes of withdrawing management and what happens there. And we have, of course, in floodplain areas or river floodplains, new spawning areas for fish and water bird population in the lagoon. Bird populations are increasing. Forest reserves are really important. We have still, although the road transport network is expansive, we have still close and connected forests, which are key for migration and for crossing animals. And of course, especially the water is a topic. We have recolonization with beavers. They are present all over, where we just, if you leave the village, you just see everywhere their activities and how they bring water into the landscape. And of course, the bison, we do not have them in our area, but just, in the corridors around 50 kilometers from our area borders, we see the expansion is coming towards the west, and we want to prepare the area for the comeback and especially the acceptance of such animals, but also to monitor carefully the barriers that are created by transport networks and the improvement and upscaling of roads, especially because we are building bigger and bigger roads, which means the fences are getting bigger and bigger, and we see that here we have a big threat to the expansion of the animals that is present, but under big pressures and restrictions. So if I have a minute, I would show you a short film about one action that we are going, also in order just to make some promo for us, because we are applying a project to the EOCA, European Outdoor Conservation Association, and we need public votes to get this project run. So it's 1 minute, but I can also share the link and we can save this minute. So it's up to you.
I'll go ahead and we'll see if it works, Peter.
Okay. Yeah, let's see if the technology is there to do it. Let's see what happens. The screen. So do you have the screens?
No, we're just seeing your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. No, that's not it. You still see my PowerPoint, or?
Yeah, just your PowerPoint, yeah.
Okay, no, so I just share the link, maybe then it would be easier. I don't know whether to change the screen.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's no problem. We'll send it around after the talk.
Yeah, I can put it in the chat now as well.
Can
so
I,
thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That was really fascinating. It's wonderful to see what's happening on the ground. I was wondering, can you explain about the area that you work in? Is it mostly private landowners? Is it mostly public land? And how are you working with the local authorities in your area, the regional governments and so on?
So yeah, we have a mosaic of forest and a lot of wetlands, grassland, so agricultural land. So it means the forest is on the Polish side, of course, comfortable, because most forests are state forests, although we have big trouble because if you know, Poland currently cuts very heavily its forest due to the social, and this government is very radical in cutting forests because of their financial needs for the state budget. But we have the good condition is that around the rivers, also the state forests are the owners of areas, and here we have a good cooperation, because forests realize that they become more and more trouble with droughts, and they realize that rewetting activities and reconnecting floodplains is also a win-win situation for them. So we have here a very good relation. We have also a lot of rather larger farms that are mainly for grazing and or for mowing. And here we have a very diverse picture, and I think here's the key problem in terms of changing cultural landscapes, because all this functions because of subsidies, and currently we have no means to compete with the subsidies. We have calculated some activities, for example, for carbon credits to convince farmers to leave this senseless mowing just for subsidies, because the hay is not used anymore, so they have problems to get rid of it, but they have to mow because of the subsidies. And we tried to calculate how carbon credits could compensate for it, but currently it's impossible to reach the same amount of subsidies that are paid for 1 hectare with this kind of credits. So we are looking more into to those farmers who have still a bit of a nature conservation heart, and maybe don't look only on the business, but also understand that wetter landscapes are more diverse and also good for them. So we have indeed just been on lawns today where 2 farmers are willing by themselves to close some ditches, and they realize that rewetting these areas brings for them also the benefits, because the droughts are coming more regularly, and they slowly learn that this is also a benefit of them. But this is, of course, this kind of difficult transformation from traditional land use, which we cannot get stop because of the subsidy system. But on the other hand, we see also that especially those farmers who are doing traditional grazing become more and more open for more traditional animals. And because this is also, grazing is a very hard job, does not generate a lot of income. And I think there we have to look, and it's very often older generations of farmers who still keep it. And it seems, and we observe it in our area, there's no younger generation willing to do the same job. So we will face probably the problem. So if these traditional farmers who do this grazing give up, we will need to look for alternatives to this as well. And this is what we are looking also in what happens if we give this area back to the water, to water, or to leave the flat plains being connected again. We have a number of peatlands, or most of these areas are former peatlands. So we slowly try to get some farmers on board to support us, because this is key in terms of we have some reserves of 200-300 hectares, but of course around this area we have 1,000-2,000 hectares of private land. And if we manage to align this nature reserve and the area of the farmers to leave it a bit wilder and do not intensify farming, we have, I think, the scale that we need for rewilding.
Very good. Thank you for that, Peter. Jordi, I might ask you to come back in there, please, just for a question. And I'm going to mute you there, Peter, just while Jordi is going to speak. It's very interesting what you said there, Peter, about the subsidies. Obviously, we all of us in our various countries live under the European Union, and the Common Agricultural Policy in particular dictates a lot of what you can and cannot do in order to get the subsidies. And that's certainly a common, something we would be very familiar with in Ireland. But another issue, Jordi, I was going to ask you was about the Natura 2000 network. And in Ireland, we have maybe nearly 15% of our land Natura 2000. You pointed out it's nearly 30% in Spain. I mean, how is rewilding compatible with Natura 2000? Is it compatible, or what are the challenges there?
Yes, I think that first of all, Natura 2000 is an incredible achievement for conservation in Europe. And this is the first thing that we must bear in mind, because I think that is something incredible and has put some common ground for all the countries in the EU regarding nature conservation and habitat and place protection. And then I think that there are different aspects. Natura 2000 has some objectives that in some cases they are very rigid even. We have some species and some habitats that need to be maintained or preserved in each site. This is good in some way, because this establishes clear objectives in some cases, and this has been very useful to protect some areas because of the risk of losing those species or those habitats. So this is very important. But in a rewilding, I think that is also related with some kind of open-endedness in the results of conservation. And this means that if we supposedly recover the natural processes that are important in a given area, then this area can be changing over time, and all the results could be potentially good because they are the results of the job of nature, let's say. Having said this, I think that there is much more room for rewilding in Natura 2000 than we could think initially. And this is, I think that this is the most important thing, because Natura 2000 establishes protected areas with some conservation objectives, and usually those areas have different habitats or have different, well, there are areas that are very small or very dedicated to only one species, but in general they are areas more or less large with different species, and I think that there is a good option to combine at some degree those both approaches. Also, because rewilding is not something of black or white. Rewilding cannot be done at its extreme of recovering natural processes to its maximum level and forgetting the area, and we don't mind of what is happening there. We live in the Anthropocene. We live in a human-dominated world. So even in the areas where we can increase the level of spontaneity in nature, recovering those processes to some degree, we cannot reach the maximum degree. And in this game of different levels of naturalness and different on some conservation objectives that could be very specific, I think that there is a good place to combine both approaches in some cases. Of course, there are cases in which it will be impossible. So maybe there are Natura 2000 sites where rewilding is not a good option, clearly, no problem. I have said before that rewilding is not for everywhere. And probably there are places where rewilding can even help us to achieve the goals, the conservation goals of Natura 2000. And probably in an easier way than what are we doing today. And this is related also with the idea of nature-based solutions. Rewilding can make some things easier about nature conservation also.
Thank you for that. We have lots of questions coming in from the panelists, and lots of people complimenting you both on your talks and your presentations. Martina has asked a question about small-scale rewilding. Now, this is interesting because I think rewilding has captured the public imagination, and everybody wants a bit of rewilding, you know, whether you live in a city or, you know, maybe you don't have so much land. So can you comment about that small-scale rewilding? Is rewilding only for huge areas, or can we do small-scale rewilding? Maybe you go first, Jordi, and then I'll ask Peter to comment on that.
Okay, I think that absolutely not. Rewilding is not only for large areas, but maybe I have been speaking, thinking more in areas relatively large. There was a question also about how large is an estate, a private estate in Spain. It can be 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 hectares, a large estate. But the idea of a scale, I think that it's very important. I think that to explain rewilding and to imagine the natural processes, we need to think in areas relatively large. But I think that having said this, rewilding can happen everywhere, even in the window of your home at some level. The difference between small areas and large areas, I think that it is the degree of management that we need to have those natural processes active. For example, in a very large areas, maybe we can have some kind of predators. In small areas, it will be impossible to have predators. So maybe we will need to use other approaches to maintain the prey populations at some adequate level. And there has been different examples of rewilding. In fact, rewilding is beginning to happen in small areas or relatively small areas, not in areas in very large areas, but in areas that are relatively small. And I think that a very, very good example of what rewilding could look like in our anthropic Europe is a place that probably you are aware of it because it is close to you. That is the Knepp estate in England. Their experience is beautifully explained in the book Wilding by Isabella Tree. And I think that this estate is 1,400 hectares, I think. And this is a very good example of rewilding, clearly, because they are recovering natural processes and they are having incredible benefits in biodiversity. But they are recovering those natural processes until the level that is possible in this land area. So they don't have predators, for example. They have to take out some part of the population of the herbivores using different approaches that can be used. For example, they make wild ecologic meat from cattle or deer as a way of maintaining the numbers in a level that it is not too much, because if you have too much, you have another philosophical or conservation problem that you can have. The result is also natural, but the natural thing is not to have herbivores without predators. So some kind of control is needed. And I think that this, to finish, brings us to a very important idea, that is, when natural processes are not, when it is not possible to recover fully natural processes, we could use more even traditional activities, even traditional uses, to mimic those natural processes. So livestock rearing, for example, if it is changed in some way, can be good to recover the role of herbivores in the landscape.
Thanks for that. Peter, I might bring you in there, please. Maybe I'll give you a different question. And it's to do with public perception and public acceptance of rewilding. And can you give us a flavor of how it is being accepted in Germany and Poland where you work? Is it popular? Is there a lot of pushback against the idea, or how is it progressing?
Well, I can speak only for my 1 year experience, and also my first, experience as a rewilder, as a young rewilder. Just to pick up what Jordi said, I would like to add one point, because we have this discussion in Germany quite a lot, because also of the term rewilding. It's difficult to translate it. In Germany, we are speaking about wilderness. And I think here you see that we always try to explain what is the difference. Rewilding, of course, in its perfect way, it will be wilderness, because then we leave it all the processes, and man is withdrawing from nature and we have wilderness. But I think rewilding is more the whole process, and this is why you can start in your backyard, but you can also do it on a huge, large scale. And this is the topic. And also in connection to the perception I have what public says. I think this is also one point that maybe is the, let's say, deficit of Natura 2000, whereas Natura 2000 is worldwide unique, I would say, because you have a legal framework with 27 countries. It's amazing. But of course, it's a very strict, you're protecting this butterfly, you're protecting this animal, you're protecting this habitat. And I think this causes very often conflicts, because people do not understand why this little thing is more important than my living, my private land and others. And I think rewilding is looking in a bigger picture and allows for processes that include the people and the changes, what Jordi said, this mimicry of natural processes. We are not going to exclude the farmers. Of course, we would wish that they are not using this high productive milk cattle, but go to maybe more traditional species, or even go out and leave fencing is a topic. We just saw today areas. You can do the same without fencing. Just this process to go there. Oh, why I should have a fence? It gives more space also for other wildlife, and I can still do my business. So I think when I talk here about rewilding, I have the impression that because it has not this kind of, we are going to protect this, and because it has to be like this in 5 years, and this is the goal we have, this is more positive to people saying, okay, what would you like to be this area in 5 years? What does it mean if you withdraw and give nature a bit more space? And many farmers are proud of seeing that suddenly a small forest is popping up, or an area is re-wetted, it becomes green, what was always gray and dusty for years. So I think rewilding has the potential to bring more, bring also the landowners and land users closer to this nature, and they seem that they are not overrun by somebody who wants this and that, but they are also creators of this nature. And they are also become rewilders and get proud of it. So this is at least what I tried to do in this 1 year, and I have the feeling that this is rather has a big positive drive, and I think this is what probably makes rewilding currently so attractive, because we are overwhelmed by researchers trying to do reactions of public stakeholder engagement in this topic. So I'm really impressed. Over the last year, we had so much interest from researchers, from private people, from donors, from others. So it seems that rewilding gives a kind of a bit of a new life into nature conservation.
Well, thank you so much for that, Peter. And I think maybe we have loads and loads of questions, but I think we've a lot to take in, and it's been wonderful to hear your stories from both of you. And I want to thank you both so much for your time and sharing those stories with us this evening. And for everybody who's been watching, I want to thank you also for tuning in. Don't forget, the Irish Wildlife Trust is a conservation charity, and if you want to support the work that we do in promoting rewilding and also bringing biodiversity back to Ireland, please do consider to join our organisation. It's iwt.ie. And I look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar next month, which is also on another exciting topic. And I'm sure in the future we will come back to the issue of rewilding. There's a lot of road to run on this one. So once again, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you so much, Jordi, and good night, and thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.